Let me give you the highlight reel of how my life imploded. Picture this: a perfect autumn evening in early October 2023. A dining table groaning under the weight of my mother's ambition, crystal glasses, gleaming silverware, and a roast that probably cost more than my car. The whole Vance clan was there: aunts, uncles, cousins, all smiling like they were in a dental commercial. The occasion? A surprise announcement. And oh, what a surprise it was. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, stood up, clinked their glasses, and with the kind of beaming pride usually reserved for Nobel Prize winners, they declared they were cashing in their chips. A huge chunk of their assets, my future inheritance included, was being liquidated. But here's the kicker. It was all for her, my sister, Saint Seraphina. They were giving it all to her, a seven-figure lump sum, to pump into her tech startup, Innovate Next. The name alone should have been a red flag. It sounded like something a corporate robot would dream up after binge-watching motivational posters. My father, a man who communicates exclusively in buzzwords and stock market reports, launched into a speech. "We see this as a strategic reallocation of family assets," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous dining room. "A proactive investment in a proven winner. It's about ensuring the Vance legacy evolves with the times." He didn't look at me, but I felt his words like a physical blow. He contrasted Seraphina's quantifiable success with my less tangible career. I'm a potter, a ceramics artist. In his world, that's one step above professional thumb twiddler. The subtext wasn't subtle. It was written in blinking neon lights. Seraphina is the future. Ilara is a bad investment. The room erupted in applause. My aunt patted my arm with a pitying look. My uncle gave me a thumbs up as if to say, "Better luck next time." The sound of clinking glasses became a dull roar in my ears. The world slowed down. It was the most public, most brutal disinheritance I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about the money. It was a statement. A meticulously planned execution of my worth in the family. I felt the hot flush of shame creep up my neck, but I held their gaze. I refused to cry. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I just sat there, a ghost at the feast. "If you'll excuse me," I mumbled, pushing my chair back. The scrape of wood against the floor felt like a scream. Of course, they followed me into the hallway. The holy trinity of my downfall: Mom, Dad, and Seraphina. The fake smiles had vanished, replaced by a wall of defensive annoyance. "Lara, don't be so dramatic," my mother hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "You're making a scene." "A scene?" I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You just publicly declared me the family failure, and I'm making a scene?" "Don't be ridiculous," my father cut in, adjusting his tie. He looked at me like I was a faulty spreadsheet. "You need to see the bigger picture. Seraphina's company is a sure thing. This benefits the entire family in the long run." The entire family except for me, I thought. Then came the final perfect nail in the coffin. Seraphina stepped forward, her face a mask of counterfeit sympathy. She placed a cold hand on my arm. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," she said, her voice dripping with insincere sorrow. The nickname was a special kind of cruelty, a relic from a childhood she had long since weaponized. It's for the best, for the family." Her eyes, however, weren't sorry at all. They were gleaming with the cold, hard light of victory. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about money or business. This was personal. This was the final checkmate in a game I never even knew we were playing so seriously. To understand the absolute carnage of that dinner, you have to understand the Vance family ecosystem. From the moment we were born, Seraphina was groomed for the spotlight, and I was the stagehand. Our childhood home was a shrine to her accomplishments. The mantelpiece wasn't for family photos, it was a shelf for Seraphina's trophies. Debate championships, science fair ribbons, a gaudy plaque for Young Entrepreneur of the Year she won at 16 for creating an app that organized your other apps. Groundbreaking stuff. I remember one week in middle school with perfect clarity. Seraphina had just won the citywide math competition. My parents threw a party, a full-blown, catered affair. My dad gave a speech about her limitless potential, and how she had his head for numbers. That same week, a small abstract sculpture I'd made won first prize at a local youth art fair. When I showed my mom the blue ribbon, she was in the middle of addressing invitations for Serafina's party. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she'd said, not even looking up from her list. "Now, have you seen the A-plus Serafina got in calculus? Your father is just thrilled. Now that's going to build a future." Subtle, Mom, real subtle. That was the rhythm of our lives. Her achievements were milestones. Mine were hobbies. Her path was a four-lane highway to success. Mine was a meandering dirt road to nowhere. I wasn't stupid. I knew my art wouldn't make me a millionaire. But it was the only thing that made me feel like myself. I learned to find my validation elsewhere, in the quiet satisfaction of shaping clay, in the approval of my art teachers, in the small, self-contained world of my creativity. I stopped showing my parents my work. It was easier than seeing the polite disinterest in their eyes. Serafina, on the other hand, thrived on their attention. She was a master of perception. She knew exactly what they wanted to see, and she delivered it with a flawless performance. But I saw the cracks. I was the observer, the quiet one in the corner, and people forget you're there. I saw her swap out a failed test paper with a forged one in high school. I heard her on the phone, taking credit for a group project she'd barely contributed to. When I tried to mention it once, my parents brushed it off. "Oh, Ellie, you're just jealous," my dad had said with a chuckle. "Serafina is ambitious. You should try to be more like her." So I stopped trying. I just watched. And I learned. I learned that in my family, the truth didn't matter as much as the story you told. And Serafina was one hell of a storyteller. There was one person who didn't buy into the Serafina myth, my great Aunt Elspeth. Elspeth Vance was my grandfather's sister, the official family eccentric. While my father was busy climbing the corporate ladder, Elspeth was climbing mountains in Peru. While my mother was hosting garden parties, Elspeth was gardening with Buddhist monks in Japan. She lived in a rambling, gloriously messy house on the coast, filled with books, art, and the ghosts of 1,000 adventures. The rest of the family treated her like a curious, slightly dangerous artifact, paying their respects once a year in a brief, awkward visit. I adored her. Starting when I was 12, my summers belonged to Elspeth. While Serafina was at coding camps or pre-college business seminars, I was on a train to the coast. Elspeth's house smelled of old paper, turpentine, and sea salt. It was the smell of freedom. She never once asked me about my grades. Instead, she'd ask, "Alara, what have you seen this week that took your breath away?" We'd spend hours in her garden, which was less of a garden and more of a beautiful riot. She taught me about the Japanese art of kintsugi, mending broken pottery with gold, making it more beautiful for having been broken. "The world wants you to be perfect, child," she told me one afternoon, her hands covered in dirt as we repotted an orchid. "Your parents, especially. They see cracks as failures. They don't understand that cracks are how the light gets in." She was the one who gave me my first proper potter's wheel. She taught me the difference between a Monet and a Manet, how to find constellations in the night sky, and how to make the perfect cup of tea. She listened to my rambling thoughts about art and life with a focused intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. She saw my quietness not as a weakness, but as a strength. "You're an observer, Alara," she'd said, her sharp blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "You see the world in light and shadow, in texture and form. They see it in profit and loss. Never let them convince you that one is more valuable than the other." She saw through my parents' obsession with Serafina with a clear, unsentimental gaze. "Your father," she'd sighed once, looking out at the ocean, "he has a calculator for a heart. And your mother is afraid of anything that can't be measured or polished. Don't hold it against them. They just can't see the music. They can only hear the noise." Those summers were my salvation. They were the foundation that the rest of my family tried so hard to demolish. They didn't know that Elspeth was building me a fortress, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. A fortress they would never be able to touch. The months after the severance were a special kind of hell. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I worked. I threw myself into my art with a desperate, furious energy. The anger and the hurt became fuel for my kiln. I taught extra pottery classes for kids, their cheerful, messy creativity a balm on my wounded soul. I took on commissions I would have turned down before. Custom dog bowls, cheesy live, laugh, love platters, anything to pay the rent on my studio. My car, a 98 beater I'd named the Millennium Falcon, finally gave up the ghost. I started taking the bus. The rent on my studio went up. I started eating a lot of ramen. It was a bleak, hand to mouth existence, but with every piece I fired and sold, a strange thing happened. A tiny, hard kernel of pride began to form in my chest. This was mine. I was surviving. I wasn't just surviving, I was building something, however small, with my own two hands. I cut off contact with my family. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a slow, quiet fade. I stopped answering their calls. I let their texts go unread. The family group chat, however, I kept muted but active. It was like a form of self-torture, I guess. A window into the world I was no longer a part of. And what a world it was. Picture of Serafina on the cover of Boston Tech Weekly, my mother posted, followed by a string of champagne bottle emojis. Innovate Next just secured another round of funding. So proud of my daughter, my father would write. There were photos of Serafina's sleek, glass-walled office, a team retreat in a luxury ski lodge in Aspen, a candid shot of her laughing with some venture capitalist, a flute of champagne in her hand. Each post was a glittering, perfectly curated advertisement for her success and a subtle, painful reminder of my failure. They were celebrating on the ashes of my inheritance, and they didn't even have the decency to pretend otherwise. It was a miserable Tuesday in July. The sky was the color of dishwater, and a relentless drizzle was plastering wet leaves to my apartment window. The mail, when it came, was the usual assortment of bills and pizza flyers, except for one. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope, heavy and formal. The return address was a law firm in Zurich, Switzerland. My heart did a weird little stutter step. This couldn't be right. It had to be a mistake. With trembling hands, I tore it open. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the message was starkly clear. My great Aunt Elspeth had passed away, peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 92. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over me. I sank onto my lumpy couch, the letter crinkling in my fist. I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, my own struggles making the trip to the coast feel like an impossible luxury. A fresh wave of guilt followed the grief, but there was more. The letter formally requested my presence in Zurich to discuss the execution of her last will and testament. Me. Not my father, her nephew. Me. A week later, I was on a plane to Switzerland, funded by a reluctant loan from my credit card. The law office was exactly what you'd expect, hushed, opulent, and smelling faintly of old money and chocolate. A stern-looking man named Mr. Dubois, who looked like he'd been born in a three-piece suit, sat me down in a leather chair that sighed when I sank into it. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice dry as parchment, "your great-aunt, Elspeth Vance, has named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate." I stared at him. "Sole beneficiary? What about my father, the rest of the family?" A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Mr. Dubois' lips. They were not mentioned. The initial inheritance was, to me, a fortune. Elspeth had left me her apartment in Paris, the one I'd heard stories about but never seen, and a portfolio of stocks and bonds worth just over $300,000. I think I stopped breathing. $300,000. It was a lifeline. It was a rescue boat. It was enough to wipe out my credit card debt, buy a new kiln, secure my studio for years, and maybe even buy a car that wasn't older than some of my students. When I called my parents to tell them, the line was silent for a long moment. "Her apartment in Paris?" my mother finally said, her voice tight. "Oh, well, that's nice." "And some stocks," I added, unable to keep a small note of triumph from my voice. "Well, I'm glad the crazy old bat left her trinkets to someone who'd appreciate them," my father grumbled. "Still, it's nothing compared to what we invested in Serafina. That's the real prize. But good for you, Alara. A bit of luck." A bit of luck. They still didn't get it. They were so blinded by Serafina's dazzling success, so certain they had backed the right horse, that they couldn't see what this meant. It wasn't luck. It was a choice. Elspeth's choice. And as I hung up the phone, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, I was in Paris. I took the train from Zurich, watching the Swiss mountains bleed into the rolling green hills of France. I found the address in the 6th arrondissement on a quiet, tree-lined street that felt a world away from the tourist chaos. The building was old and elegant, with a wrought iron lift that groaned and shuddered its way up to the 4th floor. I put the key in the lock, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. It was like stepping into Elspeth's soul. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was perfect. 2 large rooms with high ceilings and herringbone floors, flooded with the soft gray light of Paris. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny fairies, and every surface was covered in her life. Books were stacked everywhere, on shelves, on tables, on the floor. Walls were crowded with a chaotic but beautiful collection of art: small oil paintings, charcoal sketches, framed textiles. There were maps, sea glass in bowls, and a collection of teacups from around the world. It smelled just like her house on the coast: old paper, dried flowers, and a faint, lingering trace of her perfume. For the first few days, I just existed in the space. I slept in her bed, wrapped in linens that smelled of lavender. I made tea in her favorite chipped teapot. I started the slow, emotional process of sorting through her things, not as an heir, but as a historian of a life well lived. In a large sea chest at the foot of her bed, I found her journals. There were dozens of them, thick, leather-bound books filled with her elegant, spidery script. They spanned 60 years of her life. I started reading. I read about her trekking through the Himalayas in the 60s, her love affair with a painter in Rome in the 70s, her work with conservationists in the Amazon in the 80s. And I read about her family, my family. She wrote about my father's wedding to my mother, her observations sharp and painfully accurate. "Richard has married his ambition," she wrote. "Eleanor is pretty and polished, but there's a hollowness there. They will value things, not people." She wrote about our births. Serafina arrived like a declaration, a tiny, demanding creature. "Richard is delighted. He already sees her on a board of directors." And then, 2 years later, "Elara was born today. She is quiet and watchful. She has my eyes. She will have a harder road, I think. She feels things too deeply for a family that prides itself on feeling nothing at all." Reading her words was like having her in the room with me, a comforting, validating presence. She saw it all. She knew. About a week into my stay, I decided to tackle the antique roll-top desk that sat in the corner of the living room, overlooking the street. It was cluttered with old stationery, dried-up ink pots, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. As I was cleaning out one of the small cubbyholes, my fingers brushed against a piece of wood that felt loose. Curious, I wiggled it. It gave way, revealing a hidden compartment behind a false back. My heart started to beat a little faster. It felt like something out of a movie. Inside, resting on dark velvet lining, were 2 objects. The first was a small, ornate brass key attached to a simple tag with a number stamped on it. The second was a slim ledger, bound in dark green leather. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly, and opened it. The first page was titled, in Elspeth's elegant script, "The Folly Collection." What followed was a meticulous, handwritten inventory of artworks. But these weren't the charming sketches on her apartment walls. The names I read made the air leave my lungs. Rothko, Pollock, de Kooning, Richter, a small, exquisite Giacometti sculpture. The list went on and on. Next to each entry was a date of acquisition, most from the 50s and 60s, and a note on its provenance. At the bottom of each page was a single word: Geneva. This was it, the real inheritance. This was what Mr. Dubois hadn't told me about, what Elspeth had kept completely off the official books. Using her inheritance from her own father, she had quietly, brilliantly become a major art collector decades before the market exploded. The collection described in this ledger wasn't just valuable. It was a king's ransom. It was a fortune that made my parents' entire net worth look like a rounding error. It made Serafina's 7-figure startup fund look like an allowance. I leaned back in my chair, my head spinning. Double my inheritance? This wasn't double. This was a different stratosphere. This was a new life, a new world. But the discovery came with a bitter aftertaste. Why the secrecy? Why hide it all? The answer, I suspected, lay deeper in the journals. I spent the next 2 days devouring them, searching for clues. And then I found it. An entry from the spring I turned 18. March 12th, it began. I wrote to Richard and Eleanor today. I have offered to pay for Alara's tuition at the École des Beaux-Arts here in Paris. It is where she belongs. She has a true, rare gift, and to see it wither in that sterile environment they call a home is a tragedy. I have enough. I can give her this. I can give her a world where her talents are celebrated, not dismissed. I read the words over and over, my vision blurring with tears. I had applied to the Beaux-Arts. It had been my dream. I was a finalist for a scholarship, but didn't get it. I was devastated. I never knew Elspeth had tried to intervene. I flipped forward a few pages, my heart pounding. April 2nd, the next relevant entry read. I received a reply from Eleanor today. So polite, so polished, so final. They have declined on Alara's behalf. They wrote that she lacks the competitive drive for such a demanding environment and that they feel she is better served by pursuing a more practical path closer to home. They have not told her of my offer. I know they haven't. They are afraid of losing control, of her choosing a life they cannot understand or take credit for. They have clipped her wings to keep her in their cage. I see now that I cannot help her directly. They will always stand in the way. So I will have to help her indirectly. I will have to trust that one day she will be strong enough to find the key I have left for her. The ledger and the key, it all clicked into place. The secrecy, the sole inheritance, the Paris apartment as the starting point of a treasure map. This wasn't just a gift, it was a test. It was a carefully orchestrated posthumous plan to give me not just money, but the truth. The grief I felt for the stolen opportunity was immense. But it was quickly overshadowed by a cold, clarifying anger. My parents hadn't just favored my sister. They had actively, secretly, sabotaged my future. They hadn't just disinherited me a few months ago. They had been doing it my entire life. I flew back from Europe a different person. The wounded, struggling artist was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own value, in every sense of the word. I had confirmed everything with Mr. Dubois. The key opened a vault in the Geneva Freeport. The collection was real. Its value was, as he put it with a dry understatement, biblical. I was now, on paper, one of the wealthiest people I had ever known, but the money felt secondary. The truth was the real fortune, and I was about to spend it. I didn't call my parents from a burner phone or send a cryptic message. I called my mother's cell from my own number. "Alara, is that you?" "We were so worried," she began, her voice a practiced mix of concern and reproach. "I'm fine, Mother," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'm calling to invite you all to dinner, at your house, this Saturday." There was a pause. "Oh, well, I don't know if Serafina can make it. She's so terribly busy." "She'll want to be there," I cut in. Tell Dad, Saturday at 7. I hung up before she could reply. My tone left no room for negotiation. I spent the next few days preparing. I didn't buy a power suit or a flashy car. I chose my armor carefully. A simple, elegant black dress, and the quiet, unshakable confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. I arrived at precisely 7. The three of them were in the living room, arranged like a tableau of familial anxiety. My father stood by the fireplace, my mother perched on the edge of the sofa, and Serafina was scrolling furiously through her phone, emanating waves of stress. "Alara," my father said, striding forward, "good to have you back. You're looking, well." "I am well," I said, walking past him and taking a seat in the armchair opposite them. I didn't wait to be invited. "We have a lot to talk about." I started calmly. I told them about Elspeth's apartment in Paris. I described it in detail, letting them picture the life she had lived so far from their own. They exchanged slightly condescending looks. The poor, eccentric aunt. "It sounds lovely, dear," my mother said. "A perfect place for you." "It is," I agreed. "It's also where I found this." I reached into my bag and pulled out the green leather ledger. I placed it on the coffee table between us. The mood in the room shifted instantly. "What is that?" Serafina asked, finally looking up from her phone, her brow furrowed. "It's an inventory," I said, "of Elspeth's other assets, the ones she didn't keep on the books." I opened it to the first page and began to read. One Mark Rothko, untitled, blue and green, 1957. One Jackson Pollock, number 14, 1951. One Willem de Kooning, woman, 1952. I continued down the list, name after masterpiece. I watched their faces. The initial confusion morphed into shock. The shock gave way to disbelief. And finally, simmering just beneath the surface was the raw, ugly glint of greed. My father's face was pale. My mother's hand was at her throat. This is impossible," my father stammered. "She never—" The value, I said, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond, is somewhere north of $200 million. It's hard to say for sure without a formal appraisal." The silence in the room was absolute. They were staring at me, at the book, their minds reeling, calculating. I let them sit with it for a moment, let the sheer scale of what they had lost, what they had misjudged, sink in. "But that's not the most valuable thing I found," I said, my gaze locking onto my parents. "I also found her journals. I know about the Beaux-Arts. I know you got her letter, and I know you wrote back, declining on my behalf." My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her. My father's face, already pale, turned a pasty shade of gray. "Alara, you don't understand," he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We were trying to protect you. That world, it would have eaten you alive." "Protect me?" I laughed, and the sound was devoid of any humor. "You weren't protecting me. You were controlling me. You saw a future for me that you couldn't put on a spreadsheet, and it scared you. So you sabotaged it. You clipped my wings to keep me in your cage." Just then a notification lit up Serafina's phone, then another, and another. A frantic buzzing filled the tense silence. Her face went ashen as she read the screen. "What is it?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. Serafina looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "It's over," she whispered. "TechCrunch, Forbes. They just published an expose. They know. They know I stole the code for Innovate Next from my partner at Stanford." My father snatched the phone from her hand. His eyes scanned the headlines. "Innovate Next founder accused of fraud in massive IP lawsuit." "The House of Cards. How Serafina Vance's tech empire imploded." "The funding, the lawsuit." Serafina was hyperventilating now. "It's all gone, Dad. The money you gave me, it's all gone." The timing was so perfect, so devastatingly poetic, that it felt like Elspeth herself had orchestrated it from beyond the grave. My family's sure thing, their proven winner, was a fraud. The legacy they had sacrificed me for was a spectacular public sham. They stared at me, the three of them, their perfect world shattered at their feet. They were broken, exposed, and utterly ruined. And I, the family failure, the bad investment, was the one left holding all the power. In the aftermath of that night, my family crumbled. Serafina became a pariah in the tech world, buried under a mountain of legal fees and public shame. My parents' reputation, so carefully cultivated over decades, was in tatters, tainted by their daughter's fraud. The Grand Vance name was now synonymous with scandal. And then, inevitably, they came to me. Like, it wasn't a phone call, it was a pilgrimage. They showed up at the door of my small rented studio one afternoon, looking diminished and older than I had ever seen them. It wasn't an apology they were after, not really, it was a bailout. "Alara," my father began, his voice stripped of its usual booming confidence. We are in a difficult position." I was wiping clay from my hands on a towel, and I didn't stop. I looked at their desperate faces. A year ago, this moment would have been a fantasy, a vengeful dream of seeing them humbled. But looking at them now, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a profound, quiet sadness. "I know," I said. "Your sister, the lawyers." My mother whispered, her eyes pleading. "You have so much now. You could help." I finally stopped and looked at them. "I'm not giving you any money." The words hung in the air, blunt and final. My father looked like I'd struck him. "But we're your family," my mother cried. Are you? I asked, my voice soft but unyielding. A family doesn't actively sabotage one child for the benefit of another. A family doesn't build its foundation on lies and secrets. You didn't want a family. You wanted a portfolio of assets, and you mismanaged your portfolio. I told them I would offer them one thing, a chance to build something real, something honest. But it would be on my terms, with boundaries as hard and clear as fired porcelain. No more lies, no more manipulation. They left my studio empty-handed, but with that sliver of a chance. Whether they take it or not is up to them. I can't fix them. I can only fix myself. It's June now, summer in Paris. I sold a few of the lesser pieces from Elspeth's collection, enough to create a fund that will last for centuries. I kept her apartment, her journals, and her teacups. I kept the most important things. The rest of the money, the vast, intimidating bulk of it, has been put to work. Last month, I officially launched the Elspeth Vance Foundation for Unconventional Artists. It's a grant program, a residency, a mentorship network. Everything I ever dreamed of, everything Elspeth would have wanted. We seek out the quiet ones, the observers, the artists whose work can't be easily measured or polished. We give them money, yes, but more importantly, we give them validation. We give them a world that celebrates the cracks. I realize now what my true inheritance was. It wasn't the 9-figure art collection or the apartment in Paris. It was the quiet summers by the sea. It was the lesson of kintsugi. It was the validation from a woman who saw me when no one else was looking. The money is just clay. It's the tool I'm using to shape a new legacy. One based not on profit and loss, but on creativity, authenticity, and the beautiful, resilient strength of a spirit that was bent but never broken.